Well, welcome. This is our second level of spiral dynamics, looking at the general characteristics of this. Reminder that after we finish these 7 levels, we'll go back to the 7 levels and look at it through the Christian lens, and actually looking at the Christian story through the lens of each of these 7 levels. I think you'll find it most instructive to see the movement within the Judeo-Christian story of the unfolding of these particular levels. We had last week the beige level, which is the most basic one, the very instinctive, reactionary kind of level where life simply flows over, one in beige. And we saw that as the infancy part of human development. And now we get into purple. And purple has several names you could apply to it. It could be the tribal stage, the magical stage, the fantasy stage. And we mentioned in beige there were no beige people groups kind of left in the world that we know about, at least. But here we do actually get into a stage where there are people groups around. There are about 10% of the adult world population that are primarily in stage purple. And some countries will have a higher percentage than that and some less. Particularly the countries in the West are going to have usually fewer people in purple than some other places. So there's still plenty of people that are in purple around the world. And this particular level emerged in the human history about 50,000 years ago and really became fairly prominent about 40,000 years ago. So it's been a good while that purple's been around, and yet it still is here. So what happens in the transition from beige to purple is that, again, beige is rooted in almost purely and solely biological instincts, where purple represents the beginning of actual conscious mind. So it's no longer just instinctual, just responding, but there's a development of consciousness that's beginning to happen, to unfold in the human brain. And so again, and rather than life simply sweeping over one as in beige, purple is actually taking some initiative within human life. And it begins asking an important question: why? It's trying to put together, as consciousness develops, trying to put together why things are, why things happen. And is there any way that we can actually cause those things to be different or changed or manipulated in the best sense of that word? So we see the development of purple being that conditions make for a move from a small informal band to a tribe that is organized and developed and very close together. And so we see these larger groups being more defined and better organized groupings as well. So we see the move from the beige survival emphasis to now a safety emphasis. And we know that there's safety in numbers. And so we see the tribe being the focus of this particular new group. And there's also a greater efficiency that's needed as there's more population around, that we have to do things more efficiently. And so that's where the tribe and the division of labor that begins to develop and the roles that begin to develop become important to be efficient and make the best of it and have time to really create the safety and beyond issues that we see developing in purple. So we have still, it's interesting, we've got the same dangers that we had in beige. We've got a natural world that has its dangers in it from animals and weather and all sorts of things. We also have other people that are still a danger to us. But now we've got another level that's now developed, because in asking that question, why, there is the development of an animistic view of the world. And so we've got these 3 things now, at least 3 things that we have to worry about. So it's a bigger responsibility to try to keep one safe. So we have this animistic view of the world. What that means is that people in purple would see that there is a spirit behind virtually everything. So animals would have a spirit behind them. The rocks would have that. We would have trees that have spirits in. Streams have spirits in. The rivers, mountains, the sun, the sky, everything has a spirit behind it. So the answer to the why question is rolled up into this whole thing of seeing the spirits behind the physical world. So the spiritual reality behind all the physical things in the world. So there's an attempt to try to understand these forces and how they work together, what they're wanting from us, and how they wish us to respond. So they want to be on their good side. We want to placate these. We want to keep them happy. And so we want to enlist these spirits to our aid. So we want to understand that particular world. So we see this in this world now, the development of magic and the issue of mystery. Because when we ask those questions, why, we see that there's this magic world behind it. Now, the other part that's really important to understanding purple, as this brain development is happening, is an opening to the communal side of life. Remember that in spiral dynamics, we see a pendulum swing from stage to stage, from an individualistic focused stage to a communally focused stage, from me to we. So beige was, even though you were in a band, you really were in there for your own survival. So now we've moved to a communally focused one where the community now is the focus and of what we're about. And so there's even some levels of sacrifice. The community, this tribe, is of utmost importance in its survival. So we see now a sacrificial understanding of making self-sacrifice for the safety of the others in the group. So in beige, we might run when an animal attacks one of our fellow band members. In beige, we might actually run toward that because we want to help save them and rescue them. So there's a very different mentality that's beginning to develop here. So if one of us hurts, we all hurt, is the way that we begin to look at the purple level. And so in this, we see the tribe developing, and it's essentially an extended family. We see everybody as a family member, and so we're all kind of helping to take care of the kids. There are all sorts of activities that bind us together very, very deeply. But the thing to say about it, it's a hugely committed tribal understanding, but you need to understand that it only is committed to that particular tribe. Now, in spiral dynamics, at each level we go to, there's an enhanced and expanded level of inclusion that begins to happen, and stage by stage by stage, you become larger and larger. So this is obviously more so than beige, but in purple, we see it to the tribal level, but extending only to that. So everybody that's outside of our tribe is considered an enemy, a threat to our tribe and our tribal's survival, our tribe's safety. So they're seen as an enemy, and if ever our paths cross and there's any kind of risk to us, we will do anything to fight them, to take them out, to eliminate them, so that we eliminate the threat that we perceive that they would be to our tribe. And so when we look at the tribal level, when those events of crossing with other tribes happen, we see a viciousness that surprises us, because that might be a peaceable people among themselves, but it can be very, very vicious, and showing no mercy at all to people in the other tribes, whether it's men, women, children. We see it in the Bible, the Old Testament, where they're hearing God say to go into these villages of other tribes and wipe them out. Don't leave a human being left. Don't even leave an animal alive. And that's really very much a purple understanding, very, very, very tribal. So we see now also a development in purple of the expansion of consciousness, so that unlike in beige, it's all about me. The only thing we can see is myself. Now we can see ourself, certainly. We see that more clearly, that we are a unique self as distinct from other people. But we also begin to be able to see you and see us together. So there's again, an expanded relational capacity that we see unfolding. And so we now, under these safer conditions of the tribe, we see the development of roles and the division of labor. So we have some that are warriors, and that's their job. And we have medicine men and medicine women, and we have that go out harvesting the herbs and treating the ill. And we see women foraging and cooking often, the shaman seeking the will of the spirits. So there are people, different roles, and it allows for a number of things: greater safety, greater efficiency, but also it also expands the ability that these tribal people have to actually have other pursuits. In other words, they've got more time on their hands than merely just moment by moment trying to survive. There is a degree of leisure, if you will, to begin to put energy into other pursuits and understandings. And this they put into their pursuit of understanding this why question, and to explore the spiritual world and the world of spirits, of transmitting our traditions to the children and to others, to keep that story alive of where our tribes come from and how it came into being, and the triumphs and tragedies of that tribe, and to keep our story alive by all sorts of means, artistic means. Now remember, this is a pre-writing a particular time, so these stories and these ideas and these traditions and these customs and these ceremonies that develop around this story and dealing with the spirits are transmitted not through writing, written text, but here through mythology, through art, cave paintings, that sort of thing, oral history, sports and contests, rituals and ceremonies. And so in Purple, we see this expansion that allows the awakening of a rich and full and expansive imagination. And so it really is quite a move forward from what we've seen in Beige. Now, we've already talked about some characteristics in here, but I want to be more specific about characteristics and traits of Purple, whether it's in the history like we've just been talking about, human history, or how it's unfolded since the early days, and how it even looks today. What are the traits we would see in people primarily in Purple in the world today? So let's take a look at these. Beck and Cowan, who wrote the book Spiral Dynamics, listed these as the main features of Purple. First is to obey the desires of the mystical spirit beings. And we've talked about that we've got to do that. We've got to stay on their good side. We've got to understand what their will is, their desires are, and try to fulfill those. Secondly, to show allegiance to the elders, to the customs, and to the clan. So allegiance and loyalty is just high priority here. Thirdly, preserve the sacred places, sacred objects, and the rituals that bind us together. Fourthly, to bond together to ensure and find safety, to live in an enchanted magical village, and to seek harmony with nature's power. So in a nutshell, Purple will sacrifice self for the tradition and the ancestral ways. Those come first in our highest priority. We'll sacrifice ourselves to that tradition. So tradition is really, really of tremendous importance. In Purple, they see the ways of the past as reliable markers for how we negotiate the present. In other words, if it's worked in the past, we can expect it's going to work in the present. It's going to work in the future. I mean, it's worked then. Why would it not work now? And so that's where the traditions become very, very steeped in our experience. That we see how it's been done, and we stick to those because they've been reliable through the years in our tribal experience. We've always done it that way before. There's a saying that you would find in that, or even in Christianity, like give me that old time religion. It's good for the Hebrew children. It's good enough for me. And that's, hearkening back to the tradition as being the guide. So let's say, for instance, if our tribe has conducted a morning ritual at sunrise, welcoming the sun into its role that particular day, the tradition may be that we have to do that, or the sun won't actually come up and bring the earth to light. And what we have is we've done this forever and ever and ever in our tribe, and it's always worked. I mean, every single day we do this ritual, and guess what? The sun comes up. So it's reliable, it works. And so it confirms to us in this magical thinking the power of that ceremony. So you see how the tradition aspect begins to work. The leaders are really, really important, and they're to be respected. It's not the idea of going against them or challenging them. That comes in the next stage, red. But here we have leaders, we have chiefs, we have elders, we have shamans that are given our respect. They're given a lot of authority, and they're to be obeyed by every member of the tribe. It's not a choice. You've got to do that. And any attempt to do that may mean expulsion from the tribe, because you then become a risk to the tribe's safety. So the idea of individualism and personal decision is actually a relatively new idea in human history. We're going back 40,000, 50,000 years with this thing starting off. And the idea of individual autonomy, personal decision, is something that is, again, extremely new. And it can be hard for us to get our heads around that, because we're so accustomed. It's so much of our worldview that we can't even imagine a different worldview from that. I'll give you an example. I've mentioned this, my church in Nashville, we had a very high percentage of Sudanese refugees, and we're basically a community center for all the thousands of Sudanese refugees in the Nashville area. We had a lot of interchange. I was talking to one of those Sudanese leaders in our church one day, and I was just curious about, because Christianity had been a part of their tribal experience for several generations, and I was curious about that. So I asked him, well, how did Christianity come to be in your tribe? And he said, well, there was a time many, many years ago when a British Church of England Anglican missionary came through our area, and he was able to sit down and have a conversation with the chief there, and he was able to unfold what the Christian story was, and urged this chief to make a personal decision about that and accept this Christian story and worldview. And the chief actually did that. And so when the missionary left, he then announced to the whole tribe, okay, we're all Christians now. So that was how Christianity came to that village, because the chief said it, and that's the way it was. And it wasn't insincere. When you look at the faith of these particular people, it's come down to them. It's wonderful. I mean, it's this brilliant, deep, profound faith. So it really worked. But he was telling me this, and I just could not comprehend how that's possible because of my particular worldview that sees the necessity of a personal, individual decision there. Well, in purple, it doesn't require that. It's really something that the whole group and tribe comes to, and we obey our leaders. Now, one thing to say about purple leadership, this is really, really important. It's very strong leadership. It's got a lot of authority, a tremendous amount of authority, but it is not domineering, and it's not self-serving. It's not in it for itself. We see that in the next stage, in red stage. We do not see that in purple. The leader has a tremendous weight upon them, of balancing so many things, balancing the sentiments of the people, and they will listen to the people and what they're saying, balance that with all the other things. They listen to the counsel of the elders. They'll listen through the shaman to what the will of the spirits may be, and also take a look at what the traditions have always said to us. He's got to balance these things and find a decision within these very disparate elements. So it makes decision-making very, very tough and difficult. But the elders' leadership and the chief's leadership is at the service of the tribe, not at the service of themselves. So their leadership is very much sacrificial. Another aspect of purple is it's a magical, mysterious world. It's where the world of the spirits comes into play. Animism is still to be found in a number of the tribal cultures around the world. You can find that. And now it takes different forms in more Western type cultures, but if you dig below the surface, you'll see more of a magical thinking. And what magical thinking is about is that we can can do certain things as prescribed by the tradition. And as a result of doing those particular things in that particular order, that we will get a desired result in the spirit world. So that's how the magic works. It's prescribed that we have to do it that particular way, the way the tradition has described it to us. And then we'll be hopefully on the safe side of that. Now when we get to the examples, I think you'll start to see the flavor of what we're talking about here, both in the past and in the present, how this old magical thinking is still very much part of purple thinking in us and other people. Now, we mentioned this in part. In purple, there's a fear of other nearby tribal groups. And actually, as there's an expansion of population, it puts groups in closer proximity to one another. And the more closely they're aligned, the more opportunity they have to transgress one another. Therefore, the higher the chance that those conflicts will be resolved by violence and bloodshed. Now, one of the things to say about this, whatever our tribe is, we consider us not just to be a unique tribe among many unique tribes. We are the one real true tribe. In fact, even like some of the Native American names that we're very familiar with actually mean the people. So they saw themselves not as simply a tribe among lots of other Native American tribes. They were the people. Everybody else was not the people. And so this is why you can see such violence perpetrated against other tribes, and the elimination and just a guiltless violence and killing that can go on, because they're not really people. So you're not harming a human being, people like we are. They're non-people, and therefore you can kind of do anything you want to them without that being an issue of conscience. And so that's a big thing. You still see that in some places in the world where purple will come against each other. And now that the world's even more populated, those opportunities for transgression become even greater, and therefore the opportunity for conflict between people groups that are in purple becomes higher. Let's say a word too about how purple sees time. Now in beige, there was really kind of no time. It was just whatever the present was. There was no sense of what the past was, no learning from the past. There was no projecting into the future or planning into that. It was just responding to whatever is rolling over us at the moment. But now we see in purple the beginning of the development of time, of seeing past, present, and future. But it's in a particular way for most of purple. It's not the way we would see it as linear, that there's a storyline that's unfolding, but it's actually cyclical. It's going to largely follow the seasons of the year. And so it unfolds that way, but it's going somewhere. And so we can actually plan toward that. I mean, let's suppose that every year is a time of the year that we go down to the river when the salmon run's going on, and we plan toward that. We take as much of the tribes as can get there, and we make a holiday of it, but we're fishing and we're salting down the salmon for the whole year's supply. Well, that's planning, but it's based on a particular cycle of the year. I had an experience with this that I thought enlightens this a bit. Many years ago, in a former parish, we had for a while a relationship with basically an indigenous denomination down in Haiti. And I was there on one trip, and we were meeting different people around the country that were leaders. And we happened to be in a little village that Habitat for Humanity actually set up their headquarters in this village, really because of the relationship to this particular denomination. And I was talking to some of the Habitat leaders about how it was going and how their project, because they're obviously building houses there. And they said, well, it was going okay. They made some mistakes, they felt, because they didn't quite understand the entire culture. And one of the areas they were having difficulty with was, within the Habitat model is you have a lot of sweat equity in building this, but there still are the materials and things that have to be rolled into a mortgage. And because of all the sweat equity and other people helping, it keeps that amount very small. And in Haiti, they kept that amount very, very small and manageable for these families that got a new house. But they were having difficulty for having people actually repay these. And it didn't seem to be malicious about it. It just didn't do it. And so they kind of concluded, that it wasn't in their worldview particularly to pay that back. Once you got the house, it's yours. Why are you paying any money for it? You already have it, But I think it also had something to do with the issue of time in purple, that this was a range and a linear nature that was beyond purple's ability, and Haiti is massively purple. And so in this purple mentality and stage and worldview, they couldn't really see the necessity of that. It wasn't within their linear view of time. In that vein, there's learning in purple through repetition, where one person demonstrates to another how to do things. There's also, in this repetition, the tribal myths and stories that are told by the storytellers, passed on from generation to generation. And literacy is often very low in purple. And so there's reliance on stories and rituals and rites and routines for learning about things, which are transmitted through the use of symbols, of drawings, songs, chants, dances, sights, and smells. Actually, when you think about those particular elements, you might think about Christian worship too has those symbols and drawings and songs and chants and dances and sights and smells. Well, because a lot of Christianity has developed among illiterate people. And so those means are ways of actually teaching people in purple, no matter what their spiritual orientation might be in that. Another thing to say about purple is related to ecological consciousness. Now, there's the romanticizing of purple that people, particularly in stage green, which is a 6th stage, which we'll get to in a few weeks. But there's a romanticizing of purple that looks at their spirituality from an attractive point of view. Sage green has gone through the orange sort of rejection of things spiritual and is returning to spirituality. Unfortunately, green has some naivete about itself. So it looks at spiritual things like in purple and sees them kind of as equal, rather than applying some discernment, seeing that some are really sound and solid spiritual experiences and some are not. And some may be very, very superstitious or other things. And so there's a naivete in later stages that doesn't necessarily look at the spirituality in a sound way in purple. But it also does this with ecological consciousness. Now, the idea of ecological consciousness is actually a very late development thing. We look at purple and we sort of perceive this harmony with nature. And there are probably some cases where, we really can see that. But in large part, the ecological consciousness of purple is related to the fact that their footprint is really, really small. And we can see from various investigations anthropologically that what seemed to have happened is that there was sort of an indiscriminate discarding of things, as we call them artifacts now, right? Discarding things, and whenever their area got too covered over with trash, they simply moved to another area. So it wasn't that they were so ecologically conscious, they just had a smaller footprint. And so we want to be careful about not over-romanticizing that, but put it in perspective. I'll give you an example of this. This will conclude this part. We'll let Kimberly LaPointe take over to complete this presentation today. But there's a book called Sapiens, which is really quite fascinating, about the whole development of Homo sapiens from the beginning to the future, by Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli writer, historian. And he writes in there about this, and he describes an ecological disaster when the first people made it to what is now Australia. Now that was about 45,000 years ago that they made it by boat there and sort of set up shop. And what had happened in terms of the evolution of Australia over all these, ever how many years, was there was a completely unique flora and fauna all over this land. And it included 24 species of animals that were 100 pounds or more. They were completely unique in the world. And so this included a giant sloth, I mean, many, many tons, huge thing. A giant kangaroo, giant panda, giant armadillo, and a marsupial lion among these 24. Well, within a few thousand years of human beings, these people in purple arriving to Australia, 23 of the 24 species were extinct forever. And just a few thousand years after their arrival, they had primitive weapons. You know, there weren't that many of them, and yet these animals were easy prey because they didn't have a natural fear of human beings. And they also would burn vast amounts of the land, therefore taking away the food sources for these animals. And so it's not as though they were in harmony with nature. They're kind of like us. You know, they had their own priorities. And so let's not romanticize that unnecessarily, only in proper ways. So we're going to turn it over to Kimberly LaPointe. Let her take us through some more aspects of Stage Purple.
Thanks. So that was the ways in which a culture, society, people, tribe can move through purple. And then remember that for every color in spiral dynamics, there's also the individual development and the ways in which we move through these phases as individuals. And so when we talked about beige, we were talking about that very early infancy, really just about getting your needs met, crying because I'm hungry, cold, you know, very base, I need something, and so I cry out of the actual discomfort. So purple is the stage in human development, probably starts to emerge right around 6 months, where the baby moves from only reacting, as Father Michael said, to external, you know, life as it comes, reacting to the feeling of hunger, reacting to the feeling of being cold or wet or insecure in some way, to actually trying to recognize that, oh, this seems to be the same people that come into the room over and over again, and recognizing something outside themselves, the people, maybe the pets, the things, the beings in their house that are outside of themselves, and they start to connect meaning to the people and to the rituals and to the things that occur in their household. So, you know, it moves from being all about them to about the world around them. This is the very first time that the baby starts to recognize that certain behaviors can get them what they're looking for. If it's, you know, they're not just maybe crying from the absolute, you know, base feeling of hunger, but now they've realized that if they make that noise, you know, food can appear. And so then you start to develop, anybody who's had children knows that they start to develop kind of different types of cries. Everybody who's had children recognize the difference between they fell down and really hurt themselves, or when we're talking about 6 months, they're obviously not mobile yet, but a true, you know, something's occurred, or I've hurt them in some way by accident, scream, cry, to a whine, to a reach for something, to an I'd rather it be this way type of cry, because they're starting to attach, you know, meanings and able to manipulate you and that world around them for their own needs, whether it's food or affection, a hug, something like that. So that type of cause-effect ability then gives way to an ability for symbolic thinking. And so this paves the way for the emergence of language in babies, because really language is just symbols, right? So the word mom means this person, the word dad means this person, and that's repeated to them, and they start to absorb that and attach those meanings. So then we get the emergence of magical thinking in the individual in the same way that you do in, you know, in the tribe, in the early sort of thinking in a society. You also get that in the child as the child starts to emerge and try to attach whys and hows to the world around them. Why does this happen? How does this happen? You know, what are the rituals that sort of bring me this safety and attachment to the people in my world? And so this is the very, very early language stage, how why is one of the early words, and we get a lot of asking why, and we get a lot of, you know, trying to sort out how things work. And when kids are in this phase, it's sometimes annoying, sometimes adorable. But for them, we feel like we're pumping a lot of information into them, but we're taking for granted a lot of data that we understand that they don't. And so they're filling in those gaps with their own cause and effects that they've invented. So it becomes a little bit of magical thinking and cause effects. So I always think about, very little children, especially when they first become mobile, 9, 10 to 14 months, and they're toddling around. A lot of them will adapt sort of rituals. I need to touch this thing or bring this thing into this room. And it's sort of adorable and funny, but probably in their minds, and this is before the terrible twos where it's, I want this thing here because I just want it that way. And that's that assertion of independence because this is how I like my things. This is way before that. This is like where they seem to think that I have to touch this thing or do that in order to, get what I want or just to feel comfortable or to get the food or whatever. So it's probably a little bit of adorable, kind of funny, mismatched cause effect thinking at this stage. And then it gives way to imagination. And so, the example of when is my show going to be on? It starts at this time. And then the child might sort of spin around 3 times and feel like they made the show appear at that time. So yeah, Father Michael wrote that example. I will point out that no child in this day and age thinks they have to wait for a time for a show to come on. That's very much an antiquated thing. My kids are like, what do you mean you just had to wait for it to be on? But all of those things, if we try to create a structure around their world, they try to create sort of a magical way that it occurs. And so that is that imaginative piece that starts to emerge. And we, of course, feed a lot of that into it. In the early introduction episode, Father Michael talked about some of the mythology that we assign to them, Santa, things like that, where we introduce causes for these events that they have no way of understanding. They also start to connect to certain objects and places, especially, again, in that attempt to create meaning to the security and safety that they're trying to establish in their world. And so we see this in a bond sometimes to objects, the lovey type idea, the pacifier, the lovey, goes from a beige, just sucking instinct to an actual attachment that if I don't have this thing, something really terrible is going to happen, or the fuzzy toy or the blanket or whatever it is. And then, the parents too become a really, really important bond. Now we really know who mom is, and it's not just because she smells like milk, it's because she's mom, and we know that she's a really important fixture in our lives, and they get very attached to it, and they start to think that mom and dad almost have a magical quality. So if you have a background in psychology or child development, this is a stage where they're developing that object permanence, where they start to understand that things they can't see still exist just because they can't see them. They're going through this, and at this time, mom and dad are magically making their needs appear because they don't know that there's sort of food in that pantry that exists, whether you make it appear or not. And so that bond starts to really attach in a home that's safe and secure. That bond, that family bond, becomes really, really strong and almost magical in the sense that you think that your parents are all knowing and with infinite ability. And it's a really important stage to go through that bond and that quality and to feel that security. You also first get a sense of, this is the first time you develop the idea of shared tools and shared resources. So when you move to solid foods and the mom and dad are spooning with that common spoon that we share, the solid food into your mouth, as a baby, you're starting to recognize this is a food, this is a tool that we share, this is a resource we share. So you get the first sense of we together use these things to meet our needs, and that gives rise to kind of a social manners and sharing idea for the first time. Again, this is before the terrible twos where they grab it and they want to hold it, and it's about their individual power. We're still very much sharing the burden here. It's a really important developmental dimension for a kid to come through securely and to really identify the home and the family of origin as safe and secure touchstones. People who go through that stage of development and don't absorb that as one of their rings in the tree, it makes them vulnerable to being overly attached to purple thinking and purple values as a way of drawing safety and security later in their lives. And that can lead to things like joining a gang or a cult, or sort of teenage pregnancy or an ill-advised marriage or an incompatible marriage, because the idea of establishing a family unconditional bond becomes the most important thing to you. You don't have a sense of autonomy that you can sort of be safe and secure in the world or make social bonds with people outside of a family unit. And so you're sort of overly attached to that, or the idea, or pseudo idea of that from a gang or a cult type mentality. So I don't know if you want to add anything, Father Michael, before we go into sort of examples that are hanging around.
That's great.
Okay. So we have this sort of very long list of examples, and some of them are kind of, you know, off the wall, sort of magical things that are kind of hang around as part of our popular culture. Some of them are groups of people that very much exist in the world in this sort of purple stage of development. You know, and some of which are just things we've absorbed in our culture that have just, you know, are artifacts of that time. So it's kind of neat to think about. But parts of rural China, the Aborigines of Australia, tribes that exist in New Zealand, Somalia, and the heart of Europe, like Yugoslavia and Palestine, the Zulu of South Africa, Tibet, the Amazon, parts of India. Native American tribes in some ways have some elements. So some of these have some elements of purple, but of course, you know, are also functioning in a more developed world, but they still hold on to a bigger purple identity than most of us, I think is fair to say, with like the Native American example in modern times, Michael. Mm-hmm. Ancient mythology, excuse me, Mormonism, the Amish, the Na'vi from the movie Avatar, superheroes, folk tales, fairy stories, astrology, fortune cookies, animal gods and spirits, totem poles, the Day of the Dead and Halloween, urban legends, gypsies, paganism, medicine men, Stonehenge, acupuncture, magic mushrooms, sweat lodges. Kamikaze pilots and suicide bombers, in the sense that their allegiance to that group that they've sworn allegiance to and that they're a part of, are obviously the most important thing and the driving factor in their lives. So they spend some of their lives in red and blue as well, but you know, there's this purple root of nothing trumping sort of the group allegiance. Animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, white magic, black cats, walking under a ladder, all superstitions around the number 13, breaking a mirror, avoiding stepping on a crack, clan warfare, religious sacrifices, rain dances, psychic abilities, family heirlooms and religious medals. This one really resonates with me. I was saying to Father Michael, in a Roman Catholic background, if those of you who are from that background, you know, religious medals are a big part of your family culture, and that St. Christopher that you get when you get your driver's license. So some of those things really hang around as part of our culture. Lucky charms, rabbit's feet, shrines, relics, magical creatures, fairies, gnomes, omens, spells, hexes, herbal and plant medicines, drum circles, winter solstice rituals, sacred words, vampires, crosses that ward off evil, holy water, invisible friends, seances, dreams, walking the evil eye, religious statues, even national flags, which, you know, again, we can really value and be important to us, but are sort of, again, the symbolic purple origin. Secret handshakes, Freemasonry, sacred tree of life, the circle of life, Hatfield and McCoy's, ashrams, what's that? And shamans. And athletes who have rituals for luck, definitely, that's a big one. Really any rituals of luck. I have a husband that wears a very sorry flight suit because it's his lucky one. So, you know, again, these examples, some of them might seem like very almost important parts of our culture when you think about things like the flag and things like that, others that are just sort of silly and harmless, like the lucky flight suit. So it's not to say that any of them are damaging, they're just artifacts of that time in our life where we probably over-ascribe security to something that has very little power, the adult version of a lovey, kind of. So anything to add there before we go on to what we can learn?
Just to say, I mean, there's a lot of items on that list, and we have pages actually of
that was the rich list.
I could develop pages more. I mean, they're going to give us sampling from kind of different arenas to sort of get a flavor for what we're talking about by purple, and it's both, you know, personal connections, it's tribal nature, it's magical thinking, those dimensions there.
Yeah, so remembering that all of the colors have their pros and cons, they have healthy and unhealthy, they have things we can learn, but most of all, if the idea is to keep moving through the stages, they have the parts that we would hope to absorb, before we move on to what is next. So things that are good to absorb from purple, or that we hope to absorb from purple, is a sense of awe and mystery. Although we know a lot about the world now, and we have, a lot more sort of data, as it were, a sense of awe allows us to stand before the mystery with gratitude and wonder. And as Christians, this manifests itself for us in an amazement of the Creator and creation and Jesus himself. And that we should stand before the kingdom in a childlike manner, which comes from scripture, and that we should stand there with the same awe and wonder. So that's something as Christians that is important for us to absorb from purple. And it allows us to have an open mind about spiritual encounters, to be open and alert to things that come up for us as signs of God working in our lives. It allows us to have that open-mindedness that really comes from a purple way of thinking. We learn strong family bonds from it, which, for most people remains an important part of their sort of healthy development and life throughout their lives. It can be really positive for people's sense of well-being, for people to feel connected and a sense of unconditional love that roots back to their family, obviously very important in people's lives. And when approached from a healthy point of view, it can teach us the idea of sacrificial leadership. So, we move into the next phase of red, which becomes more individual and more of a power grab. And so purple can remind us that the foundation of good leadership is those that work on behalf of those they lead. And purple's strong relationship to nature, although it is not the same, as Father Michael said, as our later sort of ecological value, still the idea that the first tools come from nature can remind us that a connection to the natural world can be therapeutic. So I also just wanted to spend a quick minute on the way that the other colors might look at purple. So red sees them as kind of dependent and weak, because red is very much about you move out of purple. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But blue might see them as sort of incoherent and too mystical. Orange sees them as excessively fond of family and underperforming as an individual. Green sees them as sort of old-fashioned and primitive. I do think that difference between purple and green is very interesting, because they're both that collective. We keep talking about how you sort of go from the individual to the collective, to the individual to the collective. But the difference between the purple collective and the green collective is that purple is very much about we. How are we going to increase survival and security with each other? Whereas green is very much about they. So it's the collective, but it's about, looking out for all groups outside of yourself and being very worried about where they are and trying to ascribe, egalitarianism to them. And yellow sees them as not open enough to new ideas, typically. So the transition we're about to go to from purple to red, as we go again from me to we move again to red, which is more of a powerful self, the discovery that, okay, now we've basically got the safety down, we're functioning as this small tribal or family unit. But then it's kind of like, okay, it might feel oppressive to you. You're very interested in sort of leadership. You're starting to see that, hey, if I have more of the resources, I can, achieve different things, or I could build something myself or gain something myself. And so the features of the tribe start to feel oppressive. One begins to imagine what if, and they can start to sort of test the assumptions, like, well, maybe this isn't the only way to get food, or maybe we don't have to, kill the cow to get the sun to come up. What if we just didn't? And there starts to be the emergence of maybe we don't need to do these things. And they violate a taboo and then find out that it didn't cause what they thought it might. They push against leadership and uncover weakness in the leader, because there's sort of this, again, magical belief. And so, you start to realize in the personal side it too, that, mom can't fix all of your problems. They can't, just wave their hands and make all discomfort go away. So there starts to be an independence, and I'll just do it. And this could happen in the Zulu tribe after young men make a few visits to Soweto. It can be the natural test of limits and development of independence, which occurs in the teen years. So, again, we get a lot of that emergence of, I'll do it, I'll take control, I can do better than you. And then things of this sort opens a person to move beyond purple. So those frustrations are an important part of, again, as those overlapping waves of popping us from purple over to red. So I don't know if you want to close with the thought from the Apostle Paul.
Yeah. Well, that's our look at purple, and next time we'll look at red, and we've kind of got you a little bit primed for that. It's another fascinating and important stage. It's probably the toughest stage when we look at it in terms of its impact, but it's absolutely necessary, and to go through that in the healthiest way. So we'll take a good look at that as well. But we always want to end with a focus on what we're doing with all of this. And then again, looking at the Apostle Paul and what he said in the letter to the Romans: do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So we'll keep that in mind and keep renewing our own minds by the grace of God. So we'll see you next time. God bless.